Mr. Tong he is founder and director of the Thought Collective, a social enterprise in Singapore that promotes innovation in education and civic learning. The Thought Collective aims to nurture thought leaders and change makers among youth. He has spearheaded civic initiatives such as Stand Up for Singapore movement, the 2065 civic movement, and social innovation movements in Australia and London. Tommy came back home really late last night to work on his slides, so I'm not sure what time he slept. What time did you sleep? 2 a.m. Okay. Mr. Eun Lee, heads LGT Venture Philanthropy in Asia Pacific, a global impact investing company initiated by the princely family of Liechtenstein. He manages the Asian investment portfolio in Southeast Asia and China and is responsible for the advisory activities in the region, having closed several investments in education, renewable energy, and inclusive finance. Eun slept at 3 a.m. last night. Dr. Lim Kim Hwa comes to us from Penang. He is CEO and Head of Economics at Penang Institute, a public policy think tank that advises the Penang state government. Previously a portfolio manager at a Singapore hedge fund, a proprietary trader at Credit Suisse, and an assistant professor at the University of Cambridge, he will be giving us his views on future trends in the social space, role of government as regulator and balancer. You want to know what I was going to say about him, right? He was missing 3 weeks when I last emailed him, so I don't know what happened in those 3 weeks, but I was glad he turned up yesterday. Okay. Right, everybody. We're going to begin with Tong Yi because he is on the ground, being a social enterprise that he's founded. He's been on the ground, and I thought it'd be good to start with perspectives from the ground. And then we move on to Eun, who will talk to us from an investor standpoint in impact investing. What is it they're looking for? And then we end with more macro issues from a think tank, government policy standpoint. So, Tong Yi, would you mind taking the mic?
Right. It's often when we stay up at 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. preparing slides and collecting thoughts that we always wonder, I always wonder why I agreed to doing these things in the first place. So I always regret it. So, the challenge of the 15-minute format is always how do we take a lot of very, I guess, complex ideas and bring it down to a format where it actually is relevant and somehow also in coherence with all the other speakers on any one given panel. I really will be actually focusing upon the ground, and a typical style of presentation is that I tend to tell stories, right? So there'll be 3 main stories which I'll be telling today, right? But each one will illustrate, right? I guess important impacts or trends that are happening currently on the ground, right? And before I start this entire thing, what I'd like to do is just have a very short sharing on the idea of what we see as suffering, right? And in doing so over here, I think, right, that idea of suffering will start framing a lot of the stories that we will see, I guess, over the next course about 15 minutes or so. Suffering is not necessarily pain. It is actually what most people go through when they live in the tension of what should be and what things are, right? So yesterday was the release of the PSLE results, right? And for those of you who are not from Singapore, PSLE is basically the bane of almost all parents and sometimes the 12-year-old who is going through a national exam. And in doing so over here, you can more or less guarantee that across Singapore, there will be a significant amount of suffering. The idea itself is that there are certain results that should be, but that's not the way that things are. And as long as we live in that particular tension between should be and is, we will experience suffering. So it can happen with husbands. My husband should be, but that's not what he is. My grade should be, my career should be. I should be having water, but I don't have water. My husband should not be beating me, but he is. Right? And in that level itself, right, I used to, in a very much early part of my career, I used to despise people who used to have experienced a huge amount of pain or suffering when it came down to their bad grades. So I was always one of those students over here who had chronically bad grades, right? And I couldn't stand the ones that would cry when they get a B. It's, oh no, I don't get a... But in doing so over here, when you go much more deeper into that particular level of work, you recognize the suffering is ultimately still real, right? And as long as that tension stays between that two gaps, the suffering is there. So I'm going to begin with one particular story, and this is actually, honestly for me, the most significant event that happened for me this entire year of all the work that I did. The opportunity or privilege came when it was a student who I had taught almost in the beginning of my career. He's right now about almost 28 to 29 or so. And he had come to me sometime in the area of March, right? And the discussion itself was that he had just come back from San Francisco, and he was about to start up a new startup right there. And he wanted to consult with me whether or not he should go ahead with this particular startup, right? And essentially what it was is that it was a pornography company, right? So he had actually gone over to the States, and in the States over here, he was developing new technologies. First, he began with virtual reality, and he realized over here the most powerful application of virtual reality was really pornography, right? Or at least that's where he perceived the market would be, right? And what happened was that when they went into the market, they realized that multiple other groups were also doing VR as far as the sex industry was concerned, or the pornography industry was concerned. And he felt that that wasn't innovative. So one of the innovations that they brought in as a company, right, as a startup, was largely that, well, you will wear your 3D goggles, right, and basically you will have a live model. So unlike basically flat screens where you cannot direct, with the VR, you are able to walk around the model and basically see the model any way that you would choose to, right? But they wanted to innovate it largely by saying that, but you can also go online, right, go to Facebook and choose any of your friends, right? And after you choose your friends, you're able, therefore, to choose your friend's face and render your friend's face onto the model, right? And they were able itself, right, in the computing power to literally do that within a span of 2 minutes, which meant that I would go on, find my friend's profile page, make a button, click a button, wait 2 minutes, and then my face, depending on how many images you have put up, if you put up a whole range of images online, they will be able to actually more or less guess what the different expressions you would have, right? And then they would make that particular product. And he really felt at that point in time that this was one of the most innovative things, right, that would probably change the entire industry. Because he believed that no one is paying for content anymore, but people will still pay for a service, essentially, right? So when he explained to me as a business model, it's just saying that as far as pornography is concerned, it's content, right? And content is going to be free, and we can't earn from it. But a service, right, one in which you are paying a subscription to be able to fantasize about any one given person that's available on Facebook, right, is an amazing service, right? And his whole question was, should I therefore go ahead with the business? Right, so, highlight of my life, right? So this is the whole year, right? And he came over here, and we really had a pretty rigorous debate around this. When he finally went back, his decision was actually not to go ahead with the business, and he sold it, this time for 22 million, and he felt that was a very, very small payout, but he wanted out of this particular business. But this is a 28-year-old in Singapore that just got $22 million, right? Yeah, that was his share. There were a few others, right, that was involved. And it was an interesting part over there because when I really began to think about this, that if the technology was then passed on, and sooner or later I'm quite sure you'll hear about it, the ramifications, right, that technology will, I don't know, hit the world, right, will be absolutely amazing. And the whole nature of relationships and the nature of trust, I do believe will change. In doing so over here, I don't even think it's a case of this particular technology per se. But on the ground right now, we're noticing a whole range of different things, right, that are starting to impact these few main words. So let's talk about one which we are very much more familiar with. This is part of a marriage counseling session that I was doing this given week. And it was a lady, she was around 33 years old, and she had brought her 12-year-old daughter to sit in together with this particular session, right? And her whole question was whether or not, right, I should divorce my good-for-nothing husband, right, who only brings home the bacon but doesn't do anything else, right? And he comes home, and really, what he does is he watches TV, right? And she felt that she was extremely dissatisfied in the relationship because they were no longer having good conversations, right? And I said, we began to ask questions about in-laws, his own parents, right? Who he was learning role models from. And basically what she said is that, I am not my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, right, can put up with her husband for years, right? Largely because she's not earning an income. Right? And if it basically is out that this particular man is now somehow taking care of her, then maybe she has no right to demand for anything better within this particular marriage, right? But I earn twice, right, what my husband earns. Right? My husband's not earning small amounts. I earn twice of this. I really don't need to put up, right, with this non-relationship, right? And in doing so over here, the dynamic of the relationship has changed, right? But because the relationship has changed, trust has also changed. Because trust, essentially, is our willingness to reside in common space. Trust, essentially, is our willingness to reside in common space. So, what basically this woman was saying is that I don't want to be in a common space with this particular man anymore because the nature of relationships has changed. I do see myself as more influential, more powerful than this particular man. But you'll find over here, right, that was something that was caused, right, a long time ago from things like the Industrial Revolution, right? Affluence, better education, things itself, right? There were social motivations that we more or less pushed, right? But you'll find that today, the range of social motivations that we are pushing is a whole range of them, right? Including basically alleviating multiple women out of poverty within other societies, right? We have to get it right. As we do this, there will also be social ramifications. As we solve one, it will start affecting another. And as we do this over here, the nature of suffering will also change, which means what people think should be and the way that things are will change. This is why essentially we see markets change. The kind of businesses, right, that you're going to see survive, we know this, within this given decade or so, right, it's going to profoundly change within 15 to 20 years or so. Right? Simply because social relationships, right, have also begun to change, and people's notion of suffering, right, has changed. Suffering is what essentially causes work, right? When you pay for something as a consumer, when you vote for somebody, right, when you come to a place where you make any one given choice, it really itself is informed by currently your own suffering, right? And if your suffering changes, you vote differently, you buy differently, right, you consume differently. So in doing so over here, what we're starting to see is that there's emerging trends where there are disparate narratives all over the place, right? And in doing so over here, one of the biggest challenges that we have is really where then is the new suffering, right? Where then are the new opportunities as far as markets are concerned, or even for social entrepreneurs, right? Where then are the new sufferings as far as the social motivations are concerned, such that we begin to gear our work or businesses that way. So this happened. I think now is, well, this happened somewhere in October, September, right? I can't remember. It's a fascinating experience where I was invited by a very old friend, right, to go into one of the local international banks, right here. And this was the private meeting where I was invited to go in. And in this meeting, they explained to us a HR problem, right? And they said that this was she just got this particular role, and she was more or less parachuted into this HR role. But in doing so over here, her bank, right, had actually increased the number of homosexuals that they were hiring, not deliberately, but a huge number, a group number of homosexuals were coming into the bank, right, to begin to work there. Largely because people were recommending each other and they were coming in. So 15% of their workforce were gay, right, 15%, right. But the board, right, of this particular bank were extremely conservative Chinese, right? And the board began to notice this. And they said over here that this is something which is not in line with actually, where this organization was initially built. Right? And what happened over here was that the board began to, want to create a HR policy that actually began to be discriminatory in that sense. And in doing so over here, this lady from HR thought that this is a PR nightmare. Right, that if it got out, right, or whatever the case you're looking at social media, it will grow in a story much larger itself, right, than itself. And she said, we need to intervene now. right? Because if this story keeps continuing and keeps scaling, right, we won't be able to manage it within the long run. And she said, we are almost desperate because I have just come in, right? My HR team is new, and we don't have the influence to influence both groups at the same time, right? And we need basically a skill set to come in actually and form that particular mediation, right? But who do we look for, and how do we not make this a media fiasco? So they came in and asked, would you be willing to do this job? Right? And I said, no. I don't mind watching. If you're going to do the job. And what happened was that I recommended a coaching friend itself right there had to actually come in and do this job. And she was paid 18,000 for a day. And I asked my friend, I said, you just paid 18,000, right, to do a day of training. And she says, no, we paid 18,000 right, to avoid the media fiasco. And I did, and I went in to watch this. This was a 6-hour session where we were doing this, and I have very rarely seen that level of skill that managed the narratives and the emotions in that particular room, right? And we were seeing itself like this nature of work contributing more and more. As disparate narratives continue, right, new traits and new skill sets will start to emerge. We're not seeing this, I mean, I used to think this was just social fear among race and religion sort of things, but it's not. It's across the board, and it is gradually being monetized, right, because it's an important need for people. But the huge challenge that we have here is really, then how do we start building these platforms? And I think everybody instinctively understands that there needs to be platforms within Singapore, or within, actually most of the cities across the world, that bring in disparate groups, disparate narratives, right, and have collective, collaborative conversations. So we understand that a lot of innovation comes from actually having a diversity of people, right? But I want to imagine this in real life. How do I get a comedian, an engineer, a teacher, and a nurse, right, together in the same room? And for what particular purpose would they be there? And I'm quite sure if they do come there, right, there may be a possibility if the right mechanic or tool is brought in, that magic can be created, right? Where we understand complex problems, right, and we co-collaborate, find the common narratives, and find solutions there. Right? But talking about it on a very practical level, from a social enterprise point of view, right, we don't know how to do this. A lot of our work, right, centers upon searching for common narrative among different traits, right? What kind of event could we possibly create that I would attract, right, this many different groups together, right? And we know that running topics, or running things by topic or industry just doesn't serve anymore in handling complexity. And really what we need to do is maybe move towards a more thematic, right, change in how we create things. But what are the themes, right, that everyone resonates with, right, and will find relevance to this here we have? And we do find over here that largely it's not just the standard gaps anymore, right? If we're looking for basically, I guess, brilliant, innovative solutions, we need to be able to build complex platforms that allow everyone to interact. So this is the last closing idea. So if there is a way to maybe summarize, right, a lot of the work that we currently do in Thought Collective, it would be that, and I think it's us following that particular instinct. I do know itself right, that maybe 5 years ago, our work was weird. Right? No one really understood what the hell we were doing. Right? I still don't really understand. But in doing so over here, it is something where we are getting a lot more people coming in and saying, so what is this narrative work we should do? And what exactly are these things called platforms, right, that you're creating? And there are 3 key things that we do. We identify and nurture the commonalities with the narratives. We build the platforms for common purpose, which means we bring relevance for people to come together at the same point in time. And largely itself, right, that leads into collaboration and most meaningfully action. Right to there. Okay, so that's my beginning, and now we'll move over to Emily.
Thank you, Tong. The world is complex. And
good morning, everyone. So I just want to start off in my introduction. I was labeled an impact investor. And I just want to start by a show of hands. How many of you actually knows what that means? Okay, a sprinkling of hands. I went to a conference once when I asked the same question, and these 3 people at the back put up their hand very quickly, and I said, so people up there, what does the impact investor do? They got very excited. They said, you guys invest in dynamite companies. So just to clarify, no, I don't invest in dynamite companies. I'll spend a few minutes telling you a little bit about impact investing and what I do. but I really wanted to sort of bridge to what Tongi has done and sort of frame the kind of, at least giving you some really thought-provoking ideas about trends that exist in the social space in relation to issues like suffering, in relation to divergence, and so forth. I really wanted to sort of logically connect the next one to say that I'm going to try to present some solutions together working with you. And it's not a very easy thing to do in 15 minutes, but I want to start with the analogy of the car. Now, assuming that all of us are in this room because we are societal leaders. So that ultimately wants to bring us in a common destination of sorts. And just say, for example, that that's the car. So some people choose to run the car like a social enterprise, like Tongi. Some of you here choose to run that car as a charity. Some others choose to do it as a corporate maybe, right? So that's the vehicle of delivery. That's the vehicle of delivery of social change. And in the car, there are many stakeholders, right? For some people, they're universities. And what do the universities do? They provide research. You've heard from Lawrence this morning that Lian Center provides a lot of research for social problems. That's kind of like the roadmap or the GPS. That kind of gives you and helps refine what direction you go. At the same time, all of you, in fact, I'm sure all of you here, you guys are the drivers. You guys are the societal leaders. You guys are the people driving the car. Now, and governments and policy, which Kim Hwa will talk about later, also has a large influence because that's the infrastructure, the roads, the policies that help shape where the car can go. But one crucial piece that people often forget is who is putting fuel in the car. And that's the purpose of my sort of 15 minutes, to talk about investment, because investors are the ones that fuel that change. So I agree with Tongi in the sense that it's multi-stakeholder, but we need all these parts to work. Now, the first trend I'd like to allude you to is investment. And the first trend is, you know, the world is really very bifurcated. Traditionally, we always see the world as philanthropy or investment. Now, look over to your right, that small little bubble there, which is on average in the US is about 310 billion, which seems like a large amount of money. But think about it, it's a drop in the ocean compared to the kind of social problems that we're trying to fix today. Now, can anyone guess how much it is estimated to fix, say, climate change? Anyone? Well, the recent study suggests somewhere around the range of $10 to $17 trillion just to fix one problem. We haven't even talked about poverty, healthcare, sanitation, and so forth, right? So unfortunately, the first thing that you should understand about the world today is that it's very bifurcated. Most people think that that small little drop in the ocean on the right is going to fix all of society's problems. Now, I like to respectfully disagree. And we are part of the part of the universe that comes on the other side, which is the larger pool of capital. And you can see over the last few decades what has really happened. This emergence of what is broadly known as value investing or social responsible investing, right? And these two sort of segments that you see, ESG. Now, the first one, Lawrence touched on this a little bit in the morning. Now, ESG, imagine if all of us are investors today. ESG means that while we're making investment decisions and deploying capital, right, putting fuel in the car, we think also about environmental, social, and governance factors. Now, an evolution of that is SRI, which is known as social responsible investing. And that's kind of slightly different in the sense that on top of looking at ESG factors, they also put in certain positive and negative screens. So, for example, they might not say, I will invest in sin industries like pornography, ammunition, and so forth, but they might also put in other screens like no child labor. Okay? Now, the thing to understand here is these two categories, although it's a step in the right direction, it's driven in a way by a value, right? But none of these investors can tell you that they've created good. They can only put their hand on heart and say, we've done no harm. Okay? And that's very important to understand. So you haven't added to the social problem, but neither have you fixed it. Now that's where impact investing comes in. Now impact investing is slightly different in the sense that it's simply defined as investments intended to create positive social and environmental outcome in addition to financial return. Now if you break that down, there's really 4 components, right? And you can quite simply that we are talking about investments, but they're investments with the intentionality to create positive good. So unlike a no-harm strategy, it actually holds itself accountable to create that good. Okay, and that's a very, very important distinction. Now, just to clarify these terminology, because I know for many of you here, it's the first time that you're listening to this. So I want to bring in another concept briefly, which is a very close cousin of impact investing, which is actually our name, Venture Philanthropy. We coined it probably around 8 years ago. And it's a hybrid word that brings in the concept of venture capital, that's where venture comes from, applied to philanthropic outcomes. And the kind of principles that we bring in is the same as what venture capitalists do in Silicon Valley. We invest in and focus on few young, rapidly growing organizations. We do intensive due diligence. We look at the business model and say, what's the right kind of fuel, right? Because if you give the wrong kind of fuel to the wrong kind of car, if you put a petrol in an electric car, it would not run, okay? And we give what we consider the 3 forms of capital, which is not only financial capital, but social and it's intellectual capital. It's your networks and what's in your head, your expertise. And then we have a very long-term view, and we ultimately try to optimize what we call triple bottom line return, which is essentially in people, planet, and profit. Okay? Now, because we're in SMU, I feel obliged to at least have a quiz at this point in time to prove that you've been listening to me. So let's have a look at this. Now, if we draw a short line against social return versus financial return, and I asked all of you to sort of help me mark where traditional philanthropy is, when we write a check and you give it away, where venture philanthropy is what I just described, and impact investing. Now, let's start with traditional grant giving. So if all of us, for a moment, wrote a $100 check and we gave it away today, say to SMU, if we had to place that, let's assume all of it gives high social return. Now, where would that sit? Would that sit left, middle, or right? Okay, who says left? Who says middle? Okay, so you guys are very educated because that is absolutely the correct answer. But quite often people get it wrong. They always say, oh, it's minus return because we don't get any return, or it's 0 return. Actually, the number is minus 100% return. Because from a financial viewpoint, if I give away the $100 check and in a year from now I pick up the $100 check and I don't get any interest or return, that's 0. But from day one, the moment I give it out, it's lost already. And that's okay. I'm not saying it's bad. For some things like disaster relief, you know, charitable grants are the most powerful form of capital, and that's okay. And where is venture philanthropy then? Middle or right? Some say right. Anyone say middle? Okay. Obviously, you guys weren't listening. I'm joking. It actually sits in the middle, okay? And the reason why it sits in the middle, because it's a very flexible form of capital that can come with grants as well. It can go from donations all the way to investment. And the moment that you pair, for example, we all know at donations is minus 100%. If I pair donation with investment capital, it's minus. And eventually, if it's all investment capital, it's positive. And the last one is impact investing, which, as you know, it's all about, you know, it's in the positive terrain. They're looking for a positive return, whatever that may be. Okay, now 2 points I'd like to make before I move on, and all of you to understand these 2 points that you should remember. But number one is that these are not distinct pools of capital. Okay, they're not separate. They can be used together and they can be complementary. And sometimes it's an evolution. Sometimes when a company is small, like a small social enterprise startup, they need to rely on grants. And as they grow, as they become financially sustainable, we can migrate to investment capital. Okay, so that's really trend 1. Now I want to move on and talk about trend 2. Trend 2 is that, you know, as some of our speakers yesterday and today have mentioned, there's a blurring of lines between the not-for-profit model and the for-profit model. And as Lawrence mentioned this morning, we care less about your structure, but more on your output and your outcome. In my sort of 7 years of doing this, I've met many companies that describe themselves as cooperative, not-for-profit, but when I look at the model, they're actually very financially sustainable. In the same way, I've seen many companies describe themselves as for-profit, but when I look at the financial statements, they should have been set up as a charity. Okay? So I care less about this, but I want you guys to understand that the second trend is that there's a wide spectrum of organizations, starting obviously from businesses which are purely for-profit all the way to charitable models. But what's really interesting about this space, and where I feel that there's some very powerful solutions, are the entities that sit in the middle, because they're hybrid entities. We've all heard about how powerful social enterprise can be, but on the other side of it is very powerful. You've got companies like Unilever or Danone that have such a strong CSR component. Now the CSR component is integrated with their core business. Now what is that? And then you've got some organizations, like I was just in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago, where I went to see the YMCA, a very, very long-established Christian charity, but they've set up 2 hotels, and some of you may have stayed in Hong Kong. Now the 2 hotel accounts for 63% of their internal income. That's really powerful. There's nothing stopping YMCA from having more hotels and spinning out to standalone, social enterprise model, which is driven by Christian values, right? So the world is not black and white anymore. And in the same way, these organizations can attract a blend of capital. So as you're thinking about effective solutions for society going forward, think about using different models, okay? Now I'd like to move on to the third trend, which is really about disruptive innovation. I know that you've heard a lot of this, but it's something that's very powerful in finding a solution. Ultimately, what is a disruptive innovation, right? Why do we live in a world where the world's biggest retailer, Alibaba, has no inventory? Okay? Why do we live in a world that the world's biggest allocator of hotels has no hotels, Airbnb, right? And the list can go on. So these are forms of disruptive innovations. But what are disruptive innovations in the social space? And I wanted to show you and talk about one of our portfolio companies called Mkopa, which is in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, which essentially what I think provides a disruptive solution. Now what that solution is essentially many people in Sub-Saharan Africa have no access to electricity, affordable electricity, okay? Now what Mkopa did sort of 5 years ago when we invested in them is they made a low-cost solar home system. Now imagine sort of a solar panel which you see in the video, they put in your sort of shack of your roof, and it's got 3 cables. You can use it for light, you can use it for charging. Now a couple of things that some of you may not know. Well, most of these people, our beneficiaries there, are living below the poverty line, less than $2 a day. They have access to mobile phones. That's their only source of connecting with the market. There's actually a 63% penetration of mobile phones in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's one fact. The other fact is they have plenty of light, which can be converted through solar energy. But the issue is that they can't afford the money to buy that system. So how do we make it affordable? Now, Mkopa, you've seen in a second, combines a pay-as-you-go technology with the solar home system. So they pay a very small deposit, they take the solar home system home, and they pay with mobile credits, a little bit like a pay-as-you-go package. They pay roughly about 50 cents per day, which is actually cheaper than what they're currently paying for kerosene. And after 12 months, they own the solar home system. Okay? So I'm going to show you a short video first, and let's talk through it after. Can I have the video, please?
You can see we've got 3 lights. Got 1, 2, 3. It's very bright. My name's Joseph Loisa Biwata, and this is my shop. Many people cannot afford electricity. So with Mkopa Solar, the customer will get delighted to have paid that initial deposit, and then affording 40 shillings a day is not a problem. You may be paying bits by bits. You own it immediately after paying the last deposit in just 1 year. Actually changed the lives of people.
Yeah, these are now my cows. My name is Alex Keitang. I work in Kapanet town. I just as a farmer. The solar panel, I've just put it on the roof. And the wire, then it connects to the control, then to the control box, which is inside the house. So now, when you want to check the credit, just press it here. Then it shows me this 08 days to credit. I opted for installment 40 shillings every day, because when I get some small amount, I can deposit 100 shillings, 200, 300, depending on what I get over the week or even the month. I can even pay 1,000. Yeah, so I find it easy. Then the kitchen, the light is here. That's actually changed my life, because since I bought it, I started using it to light the 3 rooms and even charging. Yeah, and even my neighbors benefit for charging their phones. And then the balance is here. Mkopa has received your payment. Kenya shillings 150 paid to account. My account now. I find it very easy, because wherever I am, not only in town, but wherever I am, I can deposit some amount to M-Pesa and then transfer it to Mkopa.
Kwa majina naitwa Cheng Cherutich. Mimi ni fundi. Kama baba Mi naona hiyo solar ni mzuri kwa kusomea. Unajua kuna watoto wenye wako shule, sasa wakiwa na homework, solar ni rahisi, sio kama mafuta na haina moshi. Sasa na ni bright, solar ni bright. Sikuwa nafikiria, ndio nilipoona ama kuambiwa na Joseph ndio nikafurahia sana.
Okay, let's say that you don't have electricity. M-Copper will help in that the customers, they'll have saved a lot compared to they'll be buying this kerosene. It's going to be wonderful for them.
So you can kind of see where the technology is used, and this really brings me to the fourth trend, which is that no matter whether you come from it from a philanthropic perspective or investment perspective or you're a social entrepreneur, the overall trend is that people are driving more accountability and transparency in producing those outcomes. Okay, so I just want to show you a little bit here about how we look at M-Copa. So we've invested in M-Copa for 4 years now. And I'm very proud to say that we've just raised the recent round, which was over 20 million of debt financing. And that will power over 1 million homes in Nairobi, Kenya, and Uganda by 2018. If you look on the right, you will see that we measure this impact. We look across 2 dimensions, both on the reach of impact, so the number of beneficiaries or households, the number of clients that are actually living below the poverty line, and at the same time, that countries that we're expanding to, we're currently trying to bring them to Asia as well, which has the same sort of problems as Africa. And then more importantly, we also look at the depth of impact. Now, what's the material and social change on their lifestyle? The increased incomes, the ownership of assets, increased safety because they have electricity now, and at the same time, obviously reducing environmental pollution. So this is something that I think it's a very, very important trend. And I think, Lawrence alluded to this morning. In the traditional charity model, while charity organizations, many of them are fantastic, but many of them are very opaque as well. So you don't actually know where your money goes, how it's spent, and the kind of outcomes that they're delivering. Now, quite often people ask me, as an impact investor, why is it that we have a profit motive? Well, I can only speak about ourselves and generally, but the profit motives, if you know that you give money to a company that produces profit, you know one thing, they've got transparency. They can tell you exactly how they're using their finances. And more importantly, if they do have a profit, it means that they have the ability to scale. And that's the real reason why we choose to go through an impact investment model. Because if we seeded this 4 years ago as a charity doing exactly the same thing, I don't think they can get to 500,000 homes today. Okay, it's to drive scale and effectiveness of solution. And then the last slide that I want to have is just to tell you a little bit of how that's contextualized for Asia. And some of the other speakers have also mentioned, Asia is at a unique intersection between the greatest wealth and the greatest need in the same place. And that's very, very rare, okay? So with wealth comes responsibility. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is that we are new to wealth, right? We're new to wealth in the sense that Singapore is really in the 2nd or 3rd generation. So like for me, I'm 3rd generation, but my grandfather would never have thought about philanthropy because he had to put food on the table. And same with my parents. But for many of you here, we're privileged enough to start thinking about certain core issues, as in, what is my identity? What is my value system, right? What is my legacy? And this is why I wanted to share this slide, because I work for an impact investor that's ultimately seeded by a family. It's actually the princely family Liechtenstein. So Prince Max on the left is actually my boss. And it's very interesting because the family is 25 generations and 900 years old. So when you talk about things like this, and you talk about what is the legacy and what is a sustainable solution, you have a very, very different lens. And I'd like to plant the thought in each of you, because I look around and many of you are very young leaders, is to start really thinking about what is my value system, what is my identity, and what do I want my legacy to be. And I will just sort of end by telling you one story, and maybe I should do it in the form of a question. How many people here have heard of the company Standard Oil? Anyone? Okay, I see 2 ladies, maybe 3 of you. Now, I asked the same similar question. How many of you have heard of the Rockefeller family or foundation? Almost 3/4 of you. So when we're talking about sustainable legacy, I like to say that Standard Oil is the company that John D. Rockefeller started. It is the source of wealth to why Rockefeller Foundation in its 5th generation exists today. But it's surprising in a few generations how many of you have never heard of Standard Oil. But it was really the source of wealth for the Rockefeller Foundation. It is the fuel that allows them to drive the car to where they are today. And it's the name and the legacy that you will probably remember for years going forward. And it's really great because I'm great friends with Justin Rockefeller's fifth generation. And just a couple of months ago, while the family made money in oil, it's fantastic that 5 generations later, this generation has just made a pact called Divest Invest to divest all of the oil assets from their portfolio. So I'm just trying to say that as you guys are thinking about social value, as you guys are thinking as your role as societal leaders, think about legacy. Because whatever you do in this lifetime is only as good as the fact that you can make it sustain for future generations. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
Well done, Anne. That was a great lecture. I'm sure our business school will want to hire you anytime. And
Now, Kim Hwa, please.
Thank you, Cheng. So it's a difficult act to be doing the last speaker in the last session. And of course, that's probably because I didn't reply to emails. Okay, so Penang Institute is the public policy think tank for the state government. We are funded by the state government, and the Chief Minister is the chairman of our board. So we work very closely with the state government in terms of executing the policies as well as giving them ideas. So previously, we talked about the car and the fuel that goes into the car. What do we see in the future trends from the government perspective in terms of what we think we should be doing in facilitating the car to drive? What we have seen, it seems to be, let's think about it in 2 spaces, in the physical space as well as the social space. And social space, by that I mean the online media. Given that it's a young crowd, I think I'll spend more time on the online space rather than the physical space. But because we live in a globalized world, what seems to be happening is there are lots of ideas. You can have a certain idea, I can have a certain idea, and in theory, we should be respecting each other's views. And as a result of that, from the government's perspective, if I want to facilitate your idea, his idea, my idea, and we want to build a road, you end up being a spaghetti. So you have all these things coming around everywhere, and there's no coherence. And that leads to the first point that I want to touch upon, which is in terms of the challenges that we have to, from a government's perspective, you have to think about it. It's a balancing act, because what type of government or what type of policy should there be in place? Is it it's a balancing act? Do you want to respect the views of the individual, a libertarian type of approach, whereby there's a lot of respect for individualism, your views, your ideas, compared to an interventionist type of approach, that there are certain ideas and thoughts that through government policies it should be propagated. Whether you call it as propaganda or not, it's certain principles that the government rightly or wrongly believes is the right way for the society, and this is how we want the society to develop. And this, to some extent, is very related to Asia, because people think about the Asian values. So should there be a strand principle that the government should intervene in protecting the Asian values and against the quote-unquote Western non-Asian values? Or is there a right for the government to intervene that way? So then it leads to the idea of what's the respect of private information, the Data Protection Act. So lots of information we voluntarily disclose, either through your Facebook, your Twitter, etc., all these. And what can the government do or not do in that sense? Can the government and can the policymaker use this information that people voluntarily disclose online as a way of devising, changing the policies, tweaking the policies, as well as to get a feedback of whether you like it, you like how things are going or not going. And you can see it in Singapore very clearly. People voice lots of opinion about certain policies in Singapore, and then you can see the government changing on that ground. And you can also see it not happening in certain countries. People resent certain governments and then it come to a certain level, and then things start to explode, and then we have the Arab Spring. So then it comes to in terms of policy making, how do you actually balance all these? We know that a lot of information is up online, the big data, and a lot of all these are going to be more interconnected in the future through Internet of Things. Your life, your car, driverless car, where you go and where you eat, where you work, all these are all interconnected. When we move on into this space, what is the role of the government or policymaker in terms of, in some sense, safeguarding oneself, protecting the society's value, or protecting the certain religion respects, or safeguarding the society against extreme ideas? Should it be, in some sense, should it be contained in the first place, or is that a healthy development in the society? How should a government balance that? So that's in some sense the second problem, the second challenge. And in all these, an opportunity is of course a challenge, and the challenge is of course an opportunity. It depends on how you approach the respective idea. And of course, then it comes to the disruptive technologies. And it's changing the way business models and our life. The old social contract of lifetime employment seems to be over. And in, I think, Generation Y, the average time that an individual spends with an employer is about 2 years, 3 years, and it seems to be shrinking down as we go into X, Y, etc. So Airbnb changes your relationship with your asset, with yourself. You have a home, but now you have decided to sublet it out. And it then changes the way you interact with your family and the society that then and beyond. Likewise, Uber changes the whole concept of employee-employer. Are these contractors? Are these employees? If they are employees, should they be given certain rights? And these are issues that the government and perhaps the courts will have to intervene and decide. But it is not so clear. The courts decide might be in a certain direction, but is that what is acceptable to the society as well as being acceptable to the vested interest? Uber is definitely the one getting most headline on this issue of vested interest. The local taxis operators definitely resent Uber because it takes away a certain part of their business. So should the government step in and accept it or reject it? And on what policy basis should that be? All these are very new, and it is difficult to, from a policy-making perspective, to extrapolate the future growth. Uber and Airbnb didn't really exist, say, 5 years ago, or not in this level of popularity. So how would the government respond to it? Because the way the government responds to it would then dictate your relationship of the individual with the society, and then it will affect ultimately your work-life balance. How much time do you spend with your family? If you're an employee in a taxi company, you're probably committed to work certain hours. But if you're a contractor with Uber, you have a lot more flexibility in managing your time, spending more time with your family versus working, and all these changes. So these are the three opportunities or challenges I can think of from a policy-making perspective. But likewise, in terms of social space in the future, from a government perspective, you have to manage different types of external factors. The first one, ASEAN Economic Community, comes in end of this year, in a few weeks' time. In theory, it is freedom of movement. One aspect of it is freedom of movement of skilled labor. So in that sense, when people can move around, does that then change the values from one country to another country? And ASEAN itself is a very diverse society, whether it's in religion, whether it's in income, whether it's in beliefs. So how does that then cause your interaction between the society, your work, as well as yourself? And recently, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was released, out of that is, of course, the society's impact, which is people would generally think about this agreement as being purely business, investment, government procurement, all these things. But of course, beyond all this, the effect would definitely filter down to the society level and your interaction with your society. For example, what's the respect of workers' rights? Do workers have a collective bargaining power? How about child labor? How about discrimination? So in this agreement, all these are set in the sense that the signatories to this agreement would have to uphold these specific items in terms of collective bargaining, respect of individual rights, as well as no slavery, no discrimination type. But of course, beyond this, then there is definitely in Malaysia, the very controversial issue of price of medicine. And how right or not right is it for governments to be, for patent holders, for companies to be having exclusive rights to manufacture or to sell the medicine for the society. And it then changes your dynamics that you have, your interaction with the society. You might have the need for that medicine, but if your means of getting it is not there because the prices are too high, is there a space for the government to step in terms of policy making? If the government wants to step in, does it have the right to step in? If you are signatory to this agreement, for certain countries, you have to then have the respect of the patent holders' rights. So is that fair? Is that not fair? It's something that is not clear. It's clear in the agreement, but it's not clear in terms of the society tolerance and respects for that. So it is still something very new, and I guess as the Asian society and the society in this part of the world ages, it would be something that will increasingly affect all of us. So that's the first sort of impact in the future that's going to start affecting us, but it's coming from the outside world. The second is, has been here for a long time, corporate social responsibility. What I want to raise is it lip service? Sometimes people have got to the certain companies have got to the stage whereby they just treat it as lip service. People expect me to be doing that. I just assign a certain number of days of my employees, go and clean up some park, clean up some rivers, and that's it, and put some nice photos, and then put on the newspaper, put in my annual report, and write something about it, and done. Is that what it should be, or is that ways of improving such things? If there is such a need for companies to be doing corporate social responsibility, should we tap on the energy? Should we tap on the resources from there? Professor Arnold de Meyer yesterday mentioned about BP and Beyond Petroleum. I thought about this as well, probably because it was fairly big at that time in the UK. So it is shocking, say for example, to hear that the Rockefeller Foundation is divesting the oil and gas portfolio, and for an oil and gas company, BP, to be embracing a world beyond petroleum. Is it something of a good ploy from a strategic perspective to be doing that to quiet your critics, or is it a good strategy in terms of changing of your business model? That is something that we leave it to the corporate to be deciding. But what we should note of is that there's energy coming out from all these in terms of the society's expectations of what corporate should do and how we should tap on it. And I want to draw an example in Penang, which is that B. Braun is a medical device company from Germany, and the government, the state government, has tapped on B. Braun to be doing kidney dialysis centers. And it is good PR for a company, increases your presence, increases your branding, gets you more in touch with the local community, and helps you, well, do good in that sense. And how this can then be extended to a private-public partnership. Of course, from there, public-private, and then how society can come into that. So how do we actually get this going without losing sight of what the corporate should be doing in terms of delivering shareholders' return to the shareholders, doing good for the society, taking care of the local employees, their local workers, so that they can have a good work-life balance, etc., with their family. And how can a government be a facilitator in this? I used another example called Penang Science Fair. There's a big manufacturing cluster in Penang, and these companies, multinational companies, will have certain corporate social responsibilities. And how do we actually tap on this need to be increasing the society's interest in this field of sciences? And the government facilitates by bringing all these companies together and try to have a fair, let these companies showcase their technology kits, and let the local community participate in it. It is good in the sense of from different perspectives, from the society perspective, from companies, from employees' perspective. It gives them great pride to be showcasing their own products. So this, I think, in some sense, is what a government should think about in terms of framing of a policy. How do you actually tap on all these energies that is going way beyond the disruptive technologies, the society perspective, as well as the corporate perspective? The next thing that I want to sort of jump over is that to ensure that I can actually still come back to Singapore, I need to do a bit of PR for my own country, my own state. This is the physical space that we are talking about. How Penang can be using the physical environment to be reinvigorating and getting the society more excited about certain aspects. Lonely Planet recently rated Georgetown, which is the older part of Penang, 4th in the world. And what I want to highlight, and is under the red line, is that it has become one of Asia's most inventive and diverse arts communities. And it is using the physical space, social space, to be driving a certain policy of a government, to reinvigorate the city, to give it a new face of life, to give the society who has certain talents to be able to embrace as well as develop in their specific niche. So how do you actually get this? What we realize is that a lot of the properties in Georgetown is actually privately owned. So how do you actually get the local property owners to be equally excited about a project that you want to do? And of course, it is not easy, especially in an Asian culture of arts. Is probably not something that you want to do first thing you encourage your child, your kid to be doing. But it is important in terms of developing a different side of an individual. An innovative individual has to be by default not purely a mainstream person. Taking his example of his friend coming to him, it is not something that we always have to think about it immediately. So physical space, social space, and the problem and the issues that government face in this is getting more and more difficult. The ideas are more diverse. And thank you for...
Thank you, Professor. Right, everybody, I'm going to pass this time to you because I need you to keep these guys on their toes so they don't fall asleep. Can you give them very difficult questions, please? Who would like to start? Yes. So realize that governments can also be societal leaders, just as the Chief Minister is trying to do in Penang to create some social impact. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your insights. My name is Prashanti and I'm from the SMU staff. My question is for Mr. N. Lee. You spoke you spoke about venture philanthropy. It's a relatively new concept. In Asia, we have a lot of people in the last decade there's a new surge in wealth, personal wealth. So I was wondering, do you see the ecosystem around this venture philanthropy growing in this part of the world? And how do we ensure with many family-owned enterprises that this legacy goes on? And for many people, it is the first generation that is experiencing this sort of a wealth. So they're relatively new to this. How do we help set up an ecosystem where there is transparency, there is participation from families? And secondly, do you see any entry barriers for, say, common people? You work with a royal family, but somewhat medium to sort of newly wealthy, minted people somewhat, to participate in this space to create an impact.
She wants you to manage her fortune.
I don't have one, not just yet, at least.
So thank you for your question. I agree that not most of us are not fortunate enough to be princes or princesses. So it's a great question. So I'll break it down. So venture philanthropy, impact investing is very, very new concepts. As an industry, it's only been around for about 1.5 decades, and in Asia, literally for the last maybe 4 or 5 years. There's some pretty progressive developments in Singapore and the region, if you want to get to know. Some of the ones, I don't know whether anyone from AVPN is here. Kevin, I don't see Kevin here, but AVPN, Asian Venture battery has run out, Mike. Okay, there we go. Hi. AVPN is a very good source of learning. They started literally about 3 years ago with a handful of members, and I think now they have probably over 200 members. So people like yourselves, includes individuals, includes corporates, includes foundations, really geared towards learning. So that's really the first place. You have to learn first, because before you learn, you can't do, right? So that's the first thing. The second question is, how does one begin to get involved in the space? And there's several ways. So in the ecosystem, there are also several advisors. You're starting to see lots of corporates as well as banks have kind of philanthropic advisory that touches on impact investing, venture philanthropy. So there's one way. It's good to know that most university courses have an element of that as well. So that's another way. But it's just like philanthropy, right? No one can train you to be a philanthropist. The best way to, in my personal view, is to support. Firstly, start with a very personal question, which is, what country and sector do you want to help? Okay, and then get a little bit of learning. I think in Asia, a lot of people love education, but even education, there's everything that goes from early childhood, primary, secondary, tertiary, vocational, adult, and then try to find out what sector problem you want to fix. Is it access to education? Is it retention? Is it learning outcomes, right? They're different. So do a very personal search first, and then try to get some learning from there. And from that learning, you can find other people that are aligned with you and sort of share ideas. That's one way. And the second way is obviously to jump in. And the best way to jump in is to go along with a person that's really been doing it for a while. Okay? And quite often, even though we essentially take our fundings from the princely family, we actually co-invest with other families because they want to leverage on our expertise and we want to leverage on theirs. And that's the best way to do it.
Great, thank you, Anne. Questions? Go ahead. We've got one there, and we'll take both. But why don't we take 3 questions, and then you have a choice in terms of which you'd like to take.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the talk. We know that the way forward is actually to work in collaboration, and I think a lot of organizations are doing it, less so on the NGO levels, but I think for the NGOs, the way forward is definitely collaborations, working towards one common goal, and I don't think many NGOs have done that yet. Tong, in your experience, how do we create that common platform? How do we get together to lobby for change and seek funding?
And Dr. Lim, what is the role of the government in helping us achieve that goal, in helping us form collaborations towards a common goal in achieving social change for the country? Thank you.
We'll let them think for a while. Let's have your question here.
I'm Jared from the Center for Social Innovation. I have a tough question. The question is about empathy. Right? How do you scale empathy? Tongi is doing it student by student, and you're doing it philanthropist by philanthropist. But how do you get scale on such an idea which is very person to person?
Penang by Penang. We have one more question there, so take a little time to think about it. Yes.
Hi, I have a question about the role of business. So going back to your example about the car, how do you get businesses to think about these sort of social issues from the perspective of where does the oil come from in the first place, the fuel that you're actually putting in the car? How do you get them to think about and talk about how do they make their money in a way that is, you know, socially responsible, environmentally responsible, beyond just then taking that other car, you know, and doing that, because where the oil comes from in the first place, the fuel that you're actually putting into this financial fuel venture, capitalism that we're talking about, that's quite important as well in terms of extracting that fuel. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so collaboration, empathy, and then something about being socially responsible in terms of where the funding sits. Who would like to start? Tong Yi.
With regards to idea collaboration, I think one of the things that struck me most, since it's the own experiences, and this is an incident that happened about two years ago, right? Thought Collective had grown to a level where we really felt that we wanted to collaborate a lot more, and we realized that whatever that we were doing as far as impact was concerned was really a drop in the ocean, and that if we didn't actually somehow link with other organizations or even government, right, at that point in time, it really would have been futile. So the prejudice at that point in time was actually, as a social enterprise, we had an internal narrative in the organization. Don't touch the smelly corporates because they're going to pollute us, right, with their evil money-making schemes. And don't touch government because they're going to control the shit out of us, right? With whatever funding they're going to operate into that. And those particular levels of prejudice, I honestly think didn't allow us to collaborate because we wouldn't get past. And it was something where we had an internal conversation first, where we started to work through, okay, so where are these prejudices coming from, right? And the more that we went out and we began to actually connect, the more we realized actually the beliefs were half nonsense anyway. That was the first. The second thing that really began to happen was after we got rid of that particular internal narrative, right, of who to begin to work with, we then began to engage with government. And it was fascinating because there was all these like cloaked conversations so that there was this one thing we wanted to do. We wanted to start this new thing called a repeat student scholarship, right? And the idea itself was that we gave scholarships basically to the top students in Singapore. We never gave scholarships to students who were truly struggling, right? And we wanted to actually run that particular scholarship, and we felt that actually government could be the possible way to start to fund that particular scholarship right there. So we went to actually go and speak, and everyone said that was an amazing idea. We would love to work together with you, right? And that's it. So what happens is they all said it's an amazing idea, and it never really moved. I never understood why. So for years we waited, right? Trying to work through this right? And just thinking, well, maybe it's just not the right time. Then we saw another organization take on this idea, and the government was working together with them, right? And we go, Tamada. It's like, weren't we the ones that seeded this idea? How come it ended up with this particular group, right? And at that point in time, it was fine because the work was being done. But the question was asking, why did this group move so quickly and we moved like snail pace? And I know this seems obvious in retrospect. It didn't hit us at a point in time because the other group was a charity, and the government could work with the charity seamlessly, but can't work with the social enterprise because ultimately, are you an enterprise or not, right? And I really took the point as to what Lawrence was raising and what Ania is raising. Social enterprise in itself is a tool, right? And we became so much of an advocate of social enterprise that we forgot that actually that's just one part of the tool set, right, that we really had. And we really wanted to find a diverse way by which to collaborate. We actually had to open up a far more wide range of tool sets, including the setting up of our own charities, the setting up itself of full-fledged companies, right there. And yeah, social enterprises are one Trojan horse, but they're not the only Trojan horse that we can have. Yeah, so, and that range was really very important.
Go ahead. Whichever question.
Happy to attempt to tackle the empathy question, and I'm happy to try to tackle the business question very briefly. So on empathy, it's interesting. A couple of years ago when I first started in this space, I was looking at investing in a social enterprise that's called the School of Empathy. And they're essentially set up by sociologists and childcare experts. And their premise was really that empathy is formed from the age 0 to 7. Okay? That's their theory. And they have a lot of science behind it. And I remember watching this video where they put these kids together, and there's always these two perpetual bullies. I mean, these were like 5-year-old kids. One of them always bullied, would steal other people's toys and so forth. And you could go around to the reasons why they did that. Maybe it's a family environment, but suffice to say, it was a persistent bully. And something strange happened when they put a crying baby in the room, just with that one bully. And it's very interesting because at first the bully was like trying to kick the baby, it was just quite worrying. But after a while, because of all the persistent crying, the bully had to change, had to try to pacify. So anyway, I raised that example because it really depends, like everything else that we talk about, whether it's poverty, water, or it's even empathy, is to start from the root cause to say, how do you fix that problem? And if you believe, and as I do, that empathy is something like a seed that's it's inside, okay? It's not something that's very easy to fix later on. It's much better fixed from young. I almost feel very much, I spend a lot of time teaching, investing my time with the youth because I believe that we need to change the seed. Whoever taught us that we could make investments at pure financial profit without having recourse to social and environmental harm was an idiot. I'm sorry. Because we have limited resources in this world. It's a no-brainer. Okay, no offense to Kenzian. But if Kenzian had known that we had gone to this extreme of the world, we are now trying to pull back from what is otherwise morally right and it's ecological correct thing to do. It's a no-brainer. And that comes really to the second question about businesses. Now, like any decision in life, there's only a pull factor and there's a push factor. We all know that in every single decision. Now, for a for-profit business where they've been told as leaders for centuries, centuries, that your sole purpose is to profit maximize, why would they want to waste their time to invest in social and environmental causes, right? But imagine for a moment that that's changed. And I'll give you an example. I recently met a CEO of a listed company, an agricultural company, one of the largest in Asia. And they're now starting to invest in impact investing, specifically for climate change mitigation. Now, why would they do that? They're doing that as a pull factor because they've realized that in the last 2 years, there have been so many weather calamities that have hit their top line. So even their revenues are going down year on year because they're not investing in the communities of farmers and they're not investing in things that prevent or hedge against weather risk. So it's good business sense, and that's a pull factor. Now, if that's not good enough, let's talk about the push factor. As you can see with the recent sort of haze situation, there are many companies that lose millions of dollars reputationally because if they choose to do something that is wrong, it goes viral overnight. And reputational risk has a hit on your future performance and your financial performance. So many companies are now thinking to start investing in that as almost as a hedge. And I'm not going to stand and play God to judge which is right or wrong, but it's still a step in the right direction. That's my thesis.
So, Kim Hwa, you've got a question on government?
Right, okay. I think the thing that we need to think of is capital. Capital in different forms. One is political capital. The second is monetary sense. So when there is a cause, there's a need, and it's approached by some NGO, a charity, does the government have the ability to do it on its own? Or should they be more engaged to try to drive it with in collaboration with the charity? If there are many charities involved, and each of them might come with a very unique proposition, and that proposition might or might not fit with the overall strategy of the society, of the government. And also, perhaps it might also have to link in to the ranking and sequence of applying that type of course. Say, for example, if you go and say that is, we need to get people to cycle a lot more because it's healthy, it's free,
carbon free, etc., but you do not have the right means, safe bicycle track for people to do so. You don't have shelter facilities, all these things in the workplace. How do you get people to get involved? So, from a government perspective, then the government would have to think about the sequence in terms of implementing all these, as well as whether this is the right type of charity to be engaging with. Is it backed by the same type of people, reputable, good track record, etc. So that's in some sense the monetary aspect, or that's a bit of the logical aspect of the issue. Then we get to the political capital issue. All newly elected politicians have a honeymoon period, and that's where they usually want to ramp up all the more controversial issues. But beyond that, the next election cycle starts coming, and people start worrying, is this the right time to be spending on political capital? Would that affect the election the next round? And how does it affect the lobby, the vested interests, who sometimes are very strong? And in a society, you have two different extremes, and the two different extremes usually get publicity. It's the middle ground, which are more quiet, and because it's the middle ground of mainstream, it doesn't get publicized. So the government will then have to think about, is that the right type of fight I want to do to move a certain cause? Is it worthwhile at point in the political cycle to do so?
Great spokesman for the government. Dilemmas. Thank you for that question, Suez. Let's take one last round of questions because we're nearing the end time. Yes, please.
Test one. Hi, my name is Sam. I'm a humble teacher from MOE, so there's no fortune here. But we do have access to thousands and thousands of young people. And my question is this. We've talked a lot about empathy and we've talked about engaging young people, but how can we, or rather you, with your vast experience and networks and resources and money, how can we better look to strengthen partnerships with our schools so that this problem of empathy can be tackled at a much younger stage? I know it's 0 to 7, but what about 11 to 15 to 17? When you guys organize things and bring your managers on trips, is there a place where companies would look at bringing young people along as really a form of investment for the future and give them that kind of exposure that oftentimes we at MOE don't have the resources to create? I'm speaking on a personal
Thanks, Sam.
Personal platform.
Other questions? We'll give them a bit of time to think, ponder on that. Yes. Nolene has a question. And then over there, perhaps we'll let the lady start first.
Hi, my name is Yuan Ting. I'm working with youth right now, but I'm interested in helping people to connect back with the best versions of themselves, whether it's on an individual or organizational level. Thank you for your insight today. It's very grounding and eye-opening at the same time. So I have a question for all of you gentlemen. If there's one thing that you could shift, whether it's at a personal or organizational or societal level to make a difference in what's happening today, if just there's one thing you could shift, what would that be?
Good question.
Thank you.
Let's hear from Nolene.
I've always believed in following the money and to see where the money goes, because that's what would make a difference. I'm very concerned about some of the things that I've heard. And this is how do we make sure that the money goes to investing in public good and not in public bads. And this whole thing about the pornography was actually very shocking to me, because even after somebody buys it up, and of course the guy becomes rich, but the person who buys it up could actually promote it, and then it becomes a reality, and it changes the nature of our society. So how do we actually make sure that there's an ethics that is part of this whole way of behaving? So
I think Tong didn't quite finish the story.
Yeah.
You know, it's like
so
it was left hanging.
it's an opportunity.
So we'll give him some time to think through.
Yes, and one more. Of course, money comes with power as well.
So of course, the
politics around money is absolutely critical, and this is where the Penang side comes in. So how do you, because you are basically a state government in a larger context, how do you manage that?
Great, 3 great questions for us to hear them out. And
I think I better go first. I'll give them the hard ones, right? Okay, so why don't I start with your question first? And it kind of links, which I actually incompletely finished my question on empathy. I think empathy is a seed that's a feeling that's within you. It's like a moral compass. It's hard to know whether you have one or not until you have a scenario where it has to point. So that's exactly what empathy is. It's not an abstract theory, it's in practice, right? You know that you have an empathy when you see someone fall ill and you're willing to help that person, right? So I strongly recommend for many of you young people here that want to basically get more involved in this space is literally to go on the ground. So I can't speak of others, but most impact investors like ourselves have a fellowship program. And it's a 1-year fellowship program. So you generally take a year out. Yeah, it's quite competitive. I think we get about 1,000 applications every year for about 30 to 40 places. And we place each and every fellow into our portfolio organization. So it could be farms, it could be healthcare, it could be education. It's more aligned with your passion and your skill. And you spend 1 year strategically to help them as a social enterprise. You know, it could be helping them with their finances, you're helping them with their strategy, but literally being on the ground and having that connect with beneficiaries. Until you see that situation on the ground, that's how you will know whether or not your moral compass starts to point, and that's where the voice of empathy will come out. And I strongly encourage it. It doesn't have to be a structured program like fellowship, but spend time working with charities, go on the ground, visit people, you know. That's a good way to start. The second one, Noreen, to your question, which I think is a very interesting one, I can't talk about, I could go on all day about this, but I could just talk about the private markets and what we do as an investor. Because if you look at it, the definition of impact investor is the intention to do good, measured by the accountability that you're actually producing that good, right? So at any stage you can stop me. You can either stop me by saying that I do good but I don't have the correct intentions. And even if I did have the correct intention, you can stop me by saying, hang on, you invested in a rural school, but you actually didn't improve the education, right? So we're trying to close that feedback loop. And that's the way that we think to create that accountability. It's what the industry knows as mission lock. We're trying to prevent against the drift of mission drift. Okay? And we do that through a variety of ways. Naturally, as a proactive investor, we do a lot of due diligence. So we make sure that the CEO of the company, the value system aligns with us as the investors. The kind of idea of the right fuel for the right car, right? You can tell me that your electric car, but after doing your machinery, your check, I find that you're actually running on diesel, right? So it's about doing the due diligence and trying to find that there's alignment with the driver. Because you can have the best electric car, but if the driver is driving in the wrong direction, again, that's wrong. Right? So we're trying to get what we call that alignment. And we do that even in the company. We look at the incorporation documents. We see that the mission's actually in the incorporation documents. It's even hot-wired in the talent and expertise of your team. And then we measure them and hold them accountable for it. The next level, we also do it in the form of the investment. So when we give an investment to a company, we somehow have terms that say that you have to deliver that mission. We have it subject to the reporting. So if your school doesn't actually benefit X percentage of poor people and you don't actually improve the education system, it gives us the right to withdraw that investment. That holds them accountable as well. So they're just all these sort of checks and balances that we put in to make sure that they can deliver, and at the same time make sure that we are accountable as investors for that.
it's your work to fight evil as well.
Well, the case that came to me with this young man who was actually developing this technology, it troubled me quite deeply actually when it first hit me. And what happened was that I actually had a pretty extended conversation with the Attorney General's chambers, right? And the question was, if this did come to Singapore, would it be legal, right? The judge in which I was speaking to actually gave a fascinating response, right? And the first response that he gave was something we always talked about, actually even in the social enterprise field. If it doesn't happen in analog, it doesn't happen in digital. What this necessarily means that if it doesn't really happen in real life, nothing on the digital world really takes off anyway, right? The reason why that particular idea is even something which is scary is because it already happens in the minds of people, right? And what this technology is doing is simply bring out into the fore what already happens, on Earth. So when this regularly happens, right, what happens is that Attorney General Chambers said that actually there's nothing technically illegal about it, because what you're doing is that you're putting your photos in a public sphere, right? Which means that as you click on a bus and someone boards a bus together with you and looks at you, finds you attractive, brings that image into his head, right, and does that whatever he's doing with it, that's not illegal. Yeah, and that's something itself, right, which basically what this new technology is technically bring out into a digital form, right? So when he first said that, that was deeply troubling for me, right? But I understood where he was coming from. The second response, right, then came from an understanding of, so really at the heart of it, yeah, even men in this room, right, or even women in this room look at that and go, that's a repulsive idea, right? I would never ever begin to use that. So what is it, right, that this person has, right, that doesn't even perceive that this is a possible, tool, right, to use? And the core of it actually is they have empathy. I would never want this to happen to my sister, my wife, my daughter, myself, right? The troubling thing is that when my student came in and demonstrated this technology for me, he used my Facebook. Took my face and put it on this. The most troubling thing I've ever seen, right? In doing so. But by doing so, I think what was interesting about it was that empathy is really what has us begin to see the suffering of others. And it's a person with no empathy that looks at this, and just goes, well, it's just an image, right? And then we can use. The greatest defense we have against technology is not stopping technology. The greatest defense we have in technology is basically educating the consumer that is feeding it, which is why it's actually very important that goes back to actually what Sam was asking about. What are we doing in the education of children? How do we build empathy, and how do we build resilient communities that has these technologies naturally die in the market, right? Yeah.
Thanks. Kim Hwa, you want to?
Yeah, so on that, given that it's the education part of it, and that's where usually the government sector steps in terms of setting up the government, the education system, all these. So
how is that? Is public good something that in theory is the government's role to be making ensuring it's good? And of course, how do you actually champion and actually safeguard the society's values? Because with a certain degree of society's value, that's where your vote and your power and your mandate come in. And that's where the energy of the politician will be able to move to whether to encourage or discourage certain public good or public bad. So touching on the issue of how to follow the money and then the money leads to power and all these, of course, this we have seen numerous cases of how corruption and all these abuses can happen. What is important is in today's society, the information is a lot more dispersed. There will be more society pressure, that's one. Secondly, it's easier, it's more transparent for things to be out in the open. Thirdly, then how does the government respond to all these? One specific religion might have a good deed, but not necessarily another one. While the person would have a good intention, what should be done is to raise the standard, the expectation of the society of what a good behavior or good set of ethics should come from certain religions, certain government.
So you hope that the political pressure would set things right?
Implies a certain degree of transparency and accountability in the system.
Okay. We're going to end, and you can make one last statement. I suspect we haven't quite answered the second question. Do you remember?
That's a nice thing for them to end, that one thing. Shall we begin? Do you remember the question? They did very well for sleep-deprived gentlemen.
Go ahead, Tony.
I honestly don't have answers for the question because I take it very genuinely that things are interconnected these days. I don't have a priority list. If it's one thing itself that me and my other directors will talk about is that we're cause agnostic. we don't support one particular cause over another. And actually, once you start becoming too siloed into one particular cause, we actually blindside ourselves from others. So actually, I don't have a response for what's the one thing I would.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. I was thinking about it as well. But I would say it's sort of along Tong's lines, I would say it's collaboration actually. Because we can't do this alone. You know, as a private investor, I can do that for now. But what happens when these companies scale? I need governments. You know, I need to combine a few social enterprises, not just one. And I need people like you guys to continue the baton of leadership, right? To take over, because it's only as good as it can be passed down to future generations. So I would say continuity and collaboration. And I think that's really, really important, because I do agree that the space is highly fragmented and people look in their silos. They don't look past their silos. So that's one thing I would like to change.
Thank you, Anne.
I'll keep it brief, and I guess it's the empowerment of the individual is much more important.
To let the person have certain values that was championed, and that's really comes up from it.
So that with that kind of empathy, you can deal with the complexities and the evolving nature of a lot of issues.
And ethics would have to be at the center of it. Thank you, gentlemen. You did a great job.
One day, wonderful.